What do I want in a Borderlands 4? Well, it's a great question. It was actually submitted by one of our members, Lone Wolf, and as somebody who's played every single Borderlands game since the first game, as well as pretty much all of the DLC, I actually have a lot of things that I want to see them do with the franchise. And the more I talked about it, it sort of broke down into 4 categories. The first thing is the first playthrough. I have a lot of things to kind of say about what I think they should do with the first playthrough as well as the story, but I also think the second category is just as important, and it's related to the first playthrough, the end game. Exactly how should they be approaching the end game? The third category is the classes, and the fourth and the final, of course, is about the guns. So let's just start with the first playthrough, because I actually think this is something that generally all of the Borderlands games struggle with this. Borderlands 3 was actually supposed to fix it, and it really didn't. Basically, the first playthrough is disposable in many fans' minds, right? You just sort of shrug off the game, or you just shrug off the first playthrough, or you sort of dismiss it. You might even dismiss what I'm saying, because many people see that first playthrough as just sort of a, yeah, just get it over with, just rush through it. But my main issue with the first playthrough in basically every single Borderlands is that the scaling is so counterintuitive that it's actually somewhat counterproductive. Essentially what happens is you always end up over leveled, okay? The quests, the enemies, the drops, they almost inevitably end up below your level, unless you're sort of very intentional about this, or maybe you just largely avoid all of the side quests. This happens in basically every game. Now, they gave assurances that this would not happen in Borderlands 3 during co-op play, right? You're going to get the best drops, they're going to be at your level, the enemies will be at your level, so that way you could play with somebody even though you might be 5 or 10 levels ahead of them. But my wife and I played, and without fail, around level 11 or 13 or so, that's when our characters would start to suddenly be higher than the game, the enemies, the drops. Everything fell behind us. And I remember this distinctively. The first time this really struck me as a flaw in the game design of Borderlands was in Borderlands 2. And it's when they give you the Flame of the Firehawk shield. For many people, it's your first legendary in Borderlands 3. I'm sorry, in Borderlands 2. And the first time I got it, I was like 5 levels, I think, over the Flame of the Firehawks. You're like, oh wow, a legendary, and then it's like, well, it's 5 levels below where I am right now. And yes, I know people are always going to say, well, legendaries always outlast their level, right? They're stronger than the average thing at that level. But here's the thing, getting drops that are constantly not at your level turns the game into what I call a vending machine simulator, okay? There was one vending machine in Borderlands 3, and that was always sort of leveling with me, which was interesting. Like, the rest of the game wouldn't level with me, but the vending machine that sold guns in Sanctuary on the ship, it was always leveling with me. So the most effective way for me to keep good gear was to sell everything at that machine and then just use it to get new gear. Now, this is incredibly uneventful because it turns all the drops in a looter shooter into basically trash that you just always sell. Now, I say all that to say that I really want the first playthrough to be more meaningful, because everyone's just like, well, rush the first playthrough. It's not that big of a deal. You want to get to true Vault Hunter mode anyway. That's where everything scales, right? And it's like, well, that just makes the first playthrough meaningless. And it makes the story one that you just sort of gloss over. Like, well, who really cares what happens in the game if you're just rushing through that first playthrough? Now, Borderlands 2 had a great story, and you could find the recordings that would be like about your character, and I thought that was a great way to create backstory. I remember Maya's backstory being one of my favorites, sort of learning about, you know, how she was brought up. And that's another thing that I would like in the first playthrough. I would like a better story. Personally, I think they should find a way to bring back Handsome Jack. We know that he was making body doubles of himself with characters like Timothy Lawrence, who is the doppelganger playable character, but I've always thought that they could use that as a way to bring him back, right? He's using his personal transporter in Borderlands 2. He uses his personal transporter to kill Roland, and then he uses it in the fight, that final Guardian fight. Now, he could have used that to get away. He could have swapped in a body double who had gone crazy through brainwashing or something. He's so nuts, he actually thinks he's Handsome Jack. He actually thinks that he's the hero, okay? They could do that to make it seem as though, okay, Handsome Jack actually got away. I always thought that would have been very funny for them to have said, you actually kill Timothy Lawrence in Borderlands 2, but he shows up later, so it's clearly not him. But again, if Jack was making body doubles, that could be a great way to bring him back. Now, I genuinely think that that would be a great story. That'd be a nice surprise to bring back Handsome Jack. The story in Borderlands 3 was sort of decried as not that great, right? And after Borderlands 3, I don't really know if they have to bring back Handsome Jack. I'm just saying that they could, right? As long as they work in a better villain and have a more compelling and better story than Borderlands 3, I think many people would be pretty excited. So that's sort of the first category. I just want that first playthrough and the scaling and the story to all work in a better way so that it doesn't feel so completely disposable. Now, that's the second thing, though, that is related to the first playthrough, which is the endgame. Now, generally, I think that farming for really good drops is totally fine. I think that's a totally fine aspect of the game. It's pretty much unavoidable, I think, as an expectation. People are going to want to farm for the best legendaries and the best drops. But that being the primary driver to just sort of like fight harder enemies because, well, now these enemies have more health and they have more damage output, I just think we need more innovation inside of looter-shooter games when it comes to the end game. Personally, I think a hybrid-style approach to what sort of like live service games could work. Instead of just a DLC sort of being like, here's some side story, here's some extra story, here's stuff that you've never done before, you could have it be an extension of the end game. So the entire time that you're sort of gearing up and getting the best loot for your best build, well, when the DLC or the season drops or whatever that is that they want to call it, that would be almost like content waiting for you, motivating you to sort of get into the grind, go after that loot pursuit, and now that loot pursuit kind of has its meaning in the new content. Okay, I've spoken a lot about this. The ongoing content model in live service games draws a lot of criticism, and I think they should be focusing on content-driven models over player funnel-driven models, because a player-driven funnel model means you got to do FOMO, you got to have a battle pass, you got to do limited time events, you got to do things to make people come back and log in every single day. And I think that Borderlands 4 could certainly benefit from a more content-driven model because Borderlands games have already traditionally done that to a certain degree. They have DLCs, they have planned things that they add on. I think they could evolve the game in this direction, with the intention being the DLC serves as an end game trajectory, because generally speaking, I think the spiral staircase of you kind of grind to get stronger just so you can fight stronger enemies, I just don't find that to be all that compelling. I think it's time to kind of rethink that idea. I also think they did have some good ideas. They had the Proving Grounds in Borderlands 3. They've done raid bosses. I think these are all good ideas to make the end game certainly fun and compelling, but I also think there's just room for more. There's room to evolve it, so it's not just the same, well, you're replaying the game and now everything's stronger and you're getting a little bit stronger. I do think there's better room there to make a truly bigger and better Borderlands. And I honestly wonder if Borderlands 4 would even be the perfect game to offer something in the realm of like a rogue mode. Maybe you grind a rogue mode to get gear 2, or maybe the rogue mode gets harder to sort of kind of encase what's so fun, but not have it be like this constant sort of drudgery of, well, now that I'm a little bit stronger, I'm going to make everything stronger, I'm going to do another playthrough. After playing games like RoboQuest, I can't help but see the potential for some kind of a rogue mode inside of a game like Borderlands. And the reason for that is you've just got all these great guns and all these great abilities, but generally speaking, you ignore so much of them, because the further you get in the game, there are just certain builds that are better, certain guns that are better, and I'll talk more about that in a minute with the guns, but I think a rogue mode could be a really, really fun way to spice things up. And if they could somehow interweave that with the end game, so it was something that was serving the end game purposes, or if it was just a place for you to spend your time when you're sort of done with your grind or with whatever the end game is at that point in time, it could be, I think, a really fun way to extend the game's life and extend the game's relevancy. Now, related to all of this is a third thing that I want to talk about, and that is the classes, okay? Generally speaking, I think the classes in Borderlands have been totally fine, but I do think Tiny Tina Wonderlands was a good step. They went for a more classic class approach for, RPGs and things of that nature. And then they offered even a secondary class later in the game. I think the more customizable and the less siloed, the better, right? I love all the characters. I love all the classes up to now. It was even funny to see some of the class ideas that I had put out there in the past. They ended up in Borderlands 3 with the twin sirens directly. That was an idea that I had about how to have a male siren, and as well as having a Beastmaster class. That was really cool to see that show up. And I certainly don't think you want to completely move away from having very, very extravagant characters, because that is part of the Borderlands DNA. I just think that increasing customization would actually be, I think, a really good move, especially if they have deeper skill trees, if you've got more abilities, right? You don't need to have this sort of, well, here's your 3 skill trees, each skill tree has a capstone, and then that's kind of the end of it. I think you could have deeper skill trees that are far more varied, with a variety of different capstones and builds to really extend the game's life. This could even tie into some of the end game stuff that I talked about. Maybe they really don't get truly fully kitted until you've played through the game a couple of times, and then that lends itself to the new content, that lends itself to the, any raid bosses that they design, right? Because I do think raid bosses are a great way to give people something to do, but you could really have different roles that people are playing, different things that they're doing, if the actual classes themselves are far more customizable than they have been in the past. Now, the last category that I want to talk about is probably the most important category, the guns. I think a lot of my gripes with guns in a game like Borderlands is that you always tend to land on a few that are worth it, and then the rest just aren't. The early game of Borderlands 3 actually felt really diverse. This is why I think the first playthrough is so important, because you're not settling into the end game grind or the raid boss or the really challenging content where all that matters is how strong your guns are, right? My scaling issues aside, I remember trying out a lot of different weapons in Borderlands 3. I was constantly hopping around and trying out different things, and I think that is something that you want. You want people kind of bouncing around. I think the more they create guns and gun types that have innate strengths as well as innate weaknesses, I think that's just better. The alternate fire options in Borderlands 3 I thought was a good start. It kind of helps with this, right? You could have a gun that might not be so great for its primary damage, but maybe it does really, really cool things with its alt fire. There's also elemental damage. I really like needing to have on my character lots of different weapon types. The minute things land in sort of like this one-size-fits-all territory, the quicker things stop feeling like a looter shooter. Now, I'm hesitant to suggest anything like customization or crafting, because generally I think that's a huge, huge danger in a looter shooter. You can kind of make it to where people are just making the absolute best guns, and they're not really farming for guns anymore. But I do think something where guns could potentially be dismantled, right? And then maybe parts could be attached to a gun of the same type or a gun of the same make or the same manufacturer. Overall, I think guns in Borderlands are the main engine that really drives players to grind and hunt for loot. So they need to just have, I think, layered worth, as opposed to, if it's not good, you just sell it. I think that makes it very sort of black and white. It's like you're either keeping the gun or selling it. And when 10 guns drop on the ground and you sell 9 of them, I feel like that's just a missed opportunity to have more worth and value inside the guns themselves. Maybe you like a scope on this one or a magazine of another. Frankensteining your guns from other guns is very Borderlands-esque, right? It wouldn't really remove the feeling of searching for guns, farming for guns. Loot explosions would still have their value, but it would remove some of the monotony and sort of the vending machine simulator aspects of the game. So I think that would be a great way to say, hey, every gun that drops is potentially going to give you something. You can either sell it for money or you can take pieces and parts off of it. So that's it. That's what I want in a Borderlands 4. I want a first playthrough that's worth playing, better story, better villain, have the loot actually scale. I want an end game that's not just a spiral staircase. I want more depth, I want more customization in the classes, and I would love to have an evolved gun system that makes the loot table more interesting from the beginning of the game all the way to the end game. And I'd love to know what you think. If you want to roll over into an extra segment that we do, pick the member tier below, and that's when you join the channel as a member. That membership is called Member, and that gets you into tons of extra content. If you don't want to do that, that's totally fine. You can hit subscribe, you can hit the bell button, and I'll see you in the next video.